another video. Today it is how to sew a tiered and gathered skirt. So I'm going to show you the method of putting the tiers together that I use so that I end up with a clean finish on the inside. I'm also going to talk you through how I decided how many panels to put into my tiers and how I distributed them. The skirt that I'm actually wearing, I used 10 panels of the width of the fabric because I had that much fabric to use. The minimum I'd recommend is 8 panels. I did try it with 7 and I wasn't quite as happy with the outcome of that skirt as I was with the slightly fuller skirt. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to pretend that these little scraps of card I have are the full width of your fabric. So for me, I did mine at 12 inches deep and then the full width of the fabric. Like I say, recommend you either have 8 to start with, the very least 8 to start with. The skirt that I'm showing you, I actually had 10. So we're going to start with the 10 that we have for the actual tutorial that I'm showing you, but I'll show you what I do with 8 pieces of fabric as well. So these are all 12 inches wide and the full width of the fabric across. So what I did with my 10 strips of fabric is for the bottom tier I had 5 pieces of fabric. So this was 5 full widths of the fabric, all 12 inches long, and I seamed those together. For my second tier I had 3 full widths of fabric, and then for my top tier I had 2. So you can see if you're going to gather those all in, you're going to end up with a really ruffly bottom tier, slightly ruffly middle tier, and then this top edge here gets gathered down into your waist seam, so a very ruffly kind of like skirt. And you can see, I mean, it kind of gives you the idea of the sort of shape of the skirt there. So all these pieces get seamed together, you put gathering stitches along the top, pull the gathering stitches until it meets the bottom edge of the next tier up, and so on and so forth. So that's what I did with the tutorial that I'm going to show you today. But as I say, the previous ones that I've done it with 8 pieces of fabric. So when I've had 8 widths of fabric, and again, very much depends on how much actual fabric you have to start with. The dress that I'm showing you, the tutorial for, I had enough to do 10, but 8 is my minimum that I will go for. And again, these are 12 inches wide and the full width of the fabric. For 8, I would do 4 for the bottom tier. Then I'm going to do 2.5 for the top second tier, which means that I need to cut 1 in half. So 2.5 for the second tier, and then I actually do 1.5 for the top tier. But for 1.5, I also want to cut that into that one piece that I had left. I want to do it like this so that I end up with without a centre front seam running through my skirt. Show you that again because I have an extra piece, couple of pieces over here. So with 8 panels of fabric, we want 4 for the bottom tier, we want 2.5 for the second tier, and then we want 1.5 for the final tier. So what I will do is I'll take one of these and I'll cut it into half like this, and I'll put that 1/2 in here and then 1/2 on the top. So we've got 1.5 pieces of fabric there. Depending on if you have a side seam or a centre back seam, you may want to cut this piece in half as well and seam the 3 together so that you end up with a nicely even piece of fabric rather than one long bit with a little bit shoved on the end, as it were. So you seam those 3 together, those 3 together, those 4 together, and same thing, gather the top edge of the longest one and put it into the bottom edge of the next tier up, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the tier math. I read somewhere that somebody did twice their waist measurement for the first tier. I tried that, I didn't like it, so I ended up using the full width of the fabric and then doing it in this method. I hope that makes sense. So I have cut out the bodice and lining and sleeves of my dress, and I've now got this fabric left. I have 5 meters of this in total, and by the time I've ripped the 8 strips out, I will measure how much I've got left so I can give you a rough approximation of how much you'll need. I'm going to do my strips 12 inches deep because I use a slightly larger seam allowance than 5/8 of an inch, and I want my skirt to be around about, it ends up being around about 32-ish, 30 let's see if that's right. So 12, 24, 36, and then inch. Yeah, so my skirts end up being around sort of 32 to 33 inches deep, long, once I've done all the sewing and the seam allowance and the hemming and putting everything together. Depending on how tall you are, you might want to do sort of say 10 inches or 11. That's another one that I do, but I have enough fabric that I can do 12, and I do like the slightly longer skirts on me at the moment. So the next thing that I'm going to do is, on the selvage of my fabric, I've snipped into the selvage and torn this edge, so I know this edge is straight. Now again, you can totally measure and draw lines and cut along the lines, or use a rotary cutter if you feel confident doing that. I know that if I tear my fabric, I end up with a properly straight line on the grain, so that's the reason that I do this. I know not everybody likes to tear their fabric, and whichever method works for you, I just know I get straighter lines if I do it this way. That's another reason that I'm also giving myself like a ½ inch seam allowance, is to take up any of the fluff that gets created by doing it this method. So I've got my ruler, and I'm going to measure 12 inches up and make a mark, and I'm just going to keep going until I've got 8 strips, potential strips. And now I am measuring ahead of time rather than just tearing, because I want to make sure that I do have enough fabric. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to have enough fabric, because like I say, I had 5 meters of this, but I want to make sure. So we've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. Right, let's see how much I've got left after my 8th. Right, I've got just under a meter, because I have a meter marked on my table here. So I have about maybe 98 centimeters here. So I'm actually going to cut and do another 2 strips just to use the fabric, because there's not, if there was enough for a top, I totally would have done it, but this has just taken just over 4 meters of fabric to do the McCall's 7537 dress bodice with the big sleeves and this skirt. So I'm going to do the same thing. All the marks that I've made down the side, I'm going to snip into them and tear. So now I can tear the rest of my strips. I'm going to have 10 in total. It's going to be a very full skirt. So I'm just going to keep tearing my fabric and get myself all of my strips. As I mentioned, this is going to be a fuller skirt than the Savannah one that I did, because I have 2 extra strips. I think I'm going to be happy with that. Right, so next we need to actually turn these into the tiers that I've just mentioned. So let's get that done. Okay, so I have made the bodice, I have also made the sleeves, and it's now time to make the skirt. Now I have 10 of these strips of fabric. The way that I worked out the length of the strip was just to decide the length that I wanted my skirt and divide that by 3 and add my seam allowance. And I'm using a slightly larger seam allowance, 3/4 of an inch on this, because of the way that I want to seam them together. I want to use French seams, and because of the ruffles and gathers that are going to be in it, I want to use slightly larger French seams to make sure that everything gets enclosed. So as I said, I've got 10 of these, so I'm going to do 2 for the top tier, 3 for the second tier, and 5 for the final tier. The other thing is, the selvages on this fabric are actually really nice. They're nicely finished, they're not fluffy at all, so I don't need to French seam the strips when I'm sewing them together. So if you do have fluffy selvages, or you are having to cut your strips into pieces, you want to think about how you're going to attach them to each other. I'm just going to sew these with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and press them open. Then I can start putting in my gathering stitches. So as I mentioned, my top tier is going to have 2, my next tier is going to have 3, and then my bottom tier will have the final 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5, 3 and 2. So I'm going to seam the 2 together, then I'm going to seam the 3 together as a separate strip, and then I'm going to seam the 5 together as another separate strip. So I'll end up with 3 strips of different lengths. So I have sewn all of my strips together, and I've pressed my seam allowances open, and I'm now going to put in my gathering stitches. Now I'm going to put the gathering stitches in the first tier, which is the 2 strips, along the top edge. So if you have a directional print, it wants to be so that the gathering stitches are at the top and your print is going the correct way with the gathering stitches at the top. I hope that makes sense. If you don't have a directional print like me, it doesn't matter. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to run gathering stitches from one edge to the middle and stop, and then I'm going to start again from the middle and run to the other side. And that's just because I find that really long lengths of thread, if they break, it's incredibly frustrating. Ask me how I know. So I like to kind of give myself as much sort of comfort zone, like extra room for error as possible. I'm going to run the gathering stitches 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge and then 3/8 of an inch away from that. That will put the stitching line, the final stitching line, in between those two rows of gathering stitches, and I find that I just get nicer, neater gathers that way if there's gathering either side of my final stitching line. So I'm going to run some gathering stitches at the largest stitch length my machine will do, which is a 6, along the top edge of my first tier, and then I'm going to run it along the top edge of my second tier and third tier. And again, if you have a directional print, you want your gathering stitching to be at the top of the print so that the print is the right way up with the gathering stitches at the top. 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge and then 3/8 of an inch away from that, break it in the middle and start again. Hopefully that all makes sense. So I have run the gathering stitching along the top edge of my first tier, and then I have put in pins to mark the quarter points of the bottom edge of my first tier. So we've got a quarter there, the seam line is the halfway mark, then I've got another pin to mark the quarter point there, and then on my second tier, and I'm going to need this to be the wrong side up because we're doing this French seamed, because of course we are. So I have my second tier here, which is the one with 3 panels of fabric in it, and I have again quartered this. So we have the center here, marked it with a pin, and I'm going to place that towards the center of the bottom edge of my first tier, wrong sides together because I'm sewing this with French seams. And I can get away with sewing this with French seams because it's really lightweight viscose. If I was working with something heavier, then I wouldn't want to French seam this because it just wouldn't sit flatly or nicely. Cotton lawn was the other one that I've done. I did do it with a quilting cotton and it just about worked. But if you're using something heavier weight, you might want to think about a different finishing method for your seams. So I've just found my 2 quarter mark pins and I'm going to pin those together. Don't mind the cat. And then I'm pinning the edges together. So once I've got all the quarter points marked up, I'm then going to pull the gathering stitches on the top row of the second tier to ease in the large amount of fabric into the smaller amount of fabric. Once the 2 lengths of fabric are the same, I'm then going to distribute the gathers evenly, and then I will sew at 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides together along that top edge. So that's my next task, and whilst this skirt is really simple to do, this is what makes it a lengthy process. Okay, so that took me about 20 minutes, but I have stroked all the gathers and I've got the upper tier on the underneath and the second tier, the gathers, on the top, and I'm going to sew it that way so that I can make sure that all the gathers behave themselves. So I'm going to sew this together 1/4 of an inch, and then we're going to repeat the process for the next tier down, which is going to take a lot longer because there's a lot more fabric. Okay, I have sewn the 2 layers together with the wrong sides together at 1/4 of an inch, so just above the first line of gathering stitches, making sure that all of the gathers stayed up and with the raw edges flush, no gathers kind of like got tucked in or misbehaved themselves. So the next thing I'm going to do is basically the same thing again. I'm going to quarter the bottom of the second tier. We won't trim anything until we've done it all the sewing. I'm going to mark the quarter sections of the bottom tier, and I've already marked the quarter sections of the third tier, so I'm going to match those quarter sections up, pull the gathers so that everything is nicely distributed between those quarter sections, and then sew it in place wrong sides together at 1/4 inch. I have sewn my third tier onto my second tier at 1/4 inch with the wrong sides together. So now I need to trim down the edge, and I'm not going to take away too much width of fabric. I just want to get rid of this fluffy edge so that when I sew the French seam I won't end up with any of these little fluffy ends poking through the French seam. So I'm going to trim this down, and I'm not going to trim it, like I say, not going to trim it down to the usual 1/8 of an inch or under that I would, but I am going to trim it so that the fluff has gone. So I have trimmed off all the fluffy bits from the raw edge, and I am now going to go and press this with the right sides together so I can finish off the French seam and enclose all of those raw edges. So I'm going to press this right sides together, and then we can sew at 3/8 of an inch, which will be right between the two lines of gathering stitches, which hopefully should give us nice even gathers. Believe it or not, this pile of fabric is now technically a skirt. So I have sewn the remainder of my French seam at 3/8 of an inch to enclose the raw edges, probably just over to be honest, but in between the two lines of gathering stitches, and I have pressed the seam allowance up towards the next tier because that's how it wants to lie naturally anyway. So the next thing I need to do is remove all of the visible gathering stitches, which actually doesn't take too long. What I do is I go through about every sort of 3 inches or so and break the stitching with my seam ripper, and then I pull the underneath thread that's still intact, and I pull that, and it tends to come out really easily. So the next thing we need to do is attach this to your bodice of your dress, your waistband of your skirt, whatever you are attaching this to. So I've got the top side of this gathered as well, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to mark the quarter points, and I'm going to attach it to my bodice, making sure to match up the quarter points on my bodice as well so that the gathers are all evenly distributed. Once that's done, you need to sew up the side seam, put in your closure method and hem it. So I'm going to be attaching mine to a bodice of a dress. I'm then going to sew bias binding onto the raw edges, even though technically these edges are complete because I've used the selvages as my raw edges. Once the bias binding's on, then I'm going to put the zip in, then I'm going to sew the bottom of, or the side seam, it is a side seam for me, might be a back seam for you, of the bottom of the skirt closed, and then we can turn it up and hem it. Now this is a straight edge, so I'm going to run a line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, press that up, and then press that up again to do a double turned hem, sew that down, and once that's done and pressed, you're finished. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!